Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of Understanding Children and Teen Grief. And before I introduce our presenters, I just wanted to go over a few things. I wanted to let you know that a recorded version of this webinar will be available, and you will receive this recording via email next week, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel. And also, we'd love to hear from you during this presentation. So please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, make comments. You can also use the Q&A function to ask a question. Crystal and Erin will try to get your questions answered during the presentation, or if not, at the end of the hour. So go ahead now, try using that chat function. Please just let us know where you're from, where you're getting on this webinar from. I know you guys are all over the country nationally, so let us know. That would be great. So welcome again, everybody. Let me introduce our presenters so they can get started. First, we have Crystal Gowan, and Crystal is a program director of the Loss and Bereavement Program for Children and Adolescents at the Jewish Board in New York City. She coordinates and facilitates groups for children, adolescents, and their caregivers who are coping with the death of a loved one. She also provides consultation, supervision, trainings, and workshops to parents and caregivers, school professionals, and clinicians related to grief and loss. Crystal is a licensed creative art therapist and has over 15 years of experience working with children, adolescents, and adults, both individually and in groups in New York City schools, day treatment programs, outpatient clinics, private practice, and inpatient psychiatric settings. She is also the mom of two pretty awesome kids. And I would also like to introduce you to Erin Huntley. Erin also works at the Jewish Board. She is the administrative supervisor for the Loss and Bereavement Program for Children and Adolescents. She is a licensed creative art therapist with several years of experience working with clients of all ages in a variety of settings, including schools, children's grief centers, and after-school programs. Erin also provides various grief and loss trainings for clinicians, caregivers, and school staff. So our mission at the Youth Mental Health Project is to educate, empower, and support families and communities to better understand and care for the mental health of our youth. I was introduced to Crystal and Erin, and after speaking with them, I knew that they would be such a great match for our mission. So thank you, Crystal and Erin, for being with us today. Can't thank you enough. So for those of you who have just joined us, welcome again to today's session, and I'm going to hand it over to Crystal and Erin. So let me just hide myself and let you guys take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. We're really excited to be here as well. Erin, you want to share screen? Okay, we're going to get started. And as Lisa said, feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them as we're talking. So, all right, go ahead. This is us. This is our contact information. Email is the best way to reach us. We'll have it at the end too, so if you miss it, these are our two email addresses. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we do and what brings us here to the table to talk today. We work in a program in New York City that runs loss and bereavement groups for children and adolescents, mostly in schools. That's why it says students. We partner with school guidance counselors and social workers to co-facilitate a group with someone from our team in the school for students. And then we also have caregiver workshops and concurrent groups. COVID shifted that a bit, and so we also have some Zoom groups that we do as well for students and children and teens that maybe their school doesn't have enough students to run a group. We'll do a Zoom group, and those are for kids throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. We also do trainings and workshops for schools, also things like this. We do them for clinicians, So lots of different ways in which we reach folks about grief. We do some crisis consultation when there is a destabilizing event, usually a death. We go in and support staff at different programs, places in the community, schools, as they cope with that loss. And then we have an information and referral line that we provide resource support to the community. Our program's been around since 1989. It was founded by a psychiatrist who noticed a correlation between her child and adolescent patients who had depressive symptoms and their grief and loss history. It's we have a short-term model, so it's 12-week-long closed groups that we run. I think that's all we do, right, Erin?
All right, so before we begin our content, we just want to start the training, just allowing everyone to pause, just to bring in this opportunity to transition from what you were doing previously, where you were previously, and just getting settled into this space. So we just invite you to pause, get as comfortable as you can, and just take in a few deep breaths. And then just take a moment to reflect just on your current surroundings. Are you in a place that's quiet? Are you in a private space, or are there others around you? Are you giving this training your full attention, or are you multitasking? However you are coming into the space is great, is enough. Know that wherever you are in this moment is okay, and that this is your current reality. So just take a moment to acknowledge where you are, to honor where you are, and just reflecting on your current surroundings. And then based on where you're at, physically, mentally, emotionally, take a moment just to set an intention just for this hour. What is it that you want to focus on? Is there something specific that you're looking to learn? Are you here for someone? What would you like to get out of this experience? And just set that intention for the next hour. And keep taking those nice deep breaths.
We also want to acknowledge our own feelings coming into this. We are still living in a time when some folks are still having high anxiety around COVID, around other things that are happening in our world and in our country. Sometimes your anxiety may be higher or lower depending on the situation. We are also coming out of a time when anxiety was very high for a long period, when things that maybe were supposed to be safe didn't feel as safe anymore. So just acknowledging that anxiety that some of us may be holding. Also, a high amount of inequity. Inequity did not occur during the pandemic. It's been in our lives since this country was founded. However, excuse me. However, I think inequity was highlighted during the pandemic, especially with the loss of a lot of Black and brown folks to police brutality or other causes. Also inequity around COVID and food insecurity, all kinds of things that were highlighted that became more apparent during the pandemic. And then there's been a high amount of loss. And this first one, we've worked on the wording of this a lot, and it used to say the new normal, but I don't even know what normal is anymore. So it's been in thinking about the last couple of years that it's that adjusting and adapting to change, like whether it is in your personal life, whether it is in your work life, we've had to shift and adapt frequently in the last 2 years. And there's some loss and grief that can occur around that. Also loss of support for some folks. The pandemic made it harder for some folks to access support in the ways in which they felt comfortable, or in ways in which it felt useful, helpful. So just acknowledging that loss of support that some folks experienced. And then the loss of life, which a lot of us have experienced, whether it be to COVID or, folks are still dying of the things that people always die of. That also possibly could have been exacerbated by COVID, when folks weren't able to access the care that they needed in order to maintain their health. So just thinking about all of these, like the sense of loss that we've had in the past few years, and just honoring that.
All right, so waves are heavily used as a metaphor within grief and bereavement. So we wanted to talk about riding this wave, that grief is lifelong, that the goals of grief work are to minimize some of those symptoms, to increase coping skills, affect regulation. We want to be validating and normalizing, and just providing that safety and stabilization and that psychoeducation. But grief is not something that we can be cured from. So grief and bereavement is not an illness, it's not a disorder. It is natural, though painful, response to losing someone through death. I will kind of caveat, at this point, they have added a DSM for prolonged grief disorder. There are some feelings about that within the grief community, but they have added that to the DSM. So there is a little bit of there, but it is not an illness or a disorder. Grief is something that we live with. It is lifelong. There are no 5 stages to it. And the purpose, like I said, of bereavement focused support is not to promote the recovery from grief. It's lived with. You're not recovering from, you are living with. We're not moving on, we're moving forward. So we want to be able to ride that wave. And a lot of times we use that wave metaphor as when we might get hit by another grief wave, that something might come up, maybe another death, a milestone, a memory, something, and we might get hit by that wave again. And that's okay. That's part of that timeline and recovering within the symptoms. So we're not recovering from grief. And in kind of going along with that, because grief is messy. It's so many different things. I tell my kids that grief is this little word that means so many things. Grief can mean behaviors, feelings, thoughts, attitudes, so many different things that grief can feel. So especially in our group work, we want to ask kids, what does grief mean to you? What does your grief feel like? So we say, Crystal and I are art therapists. We really like pictures and imagery a lot. So this is our wishful thinking of how we want grief to work. We want it to have this beginning and this end. And that's it. It is linear. We know where we're going. We know what to expect. It's going to end at some point, and then we're going to get back to how we felt before. But how grief actually works is there is this beginning, and then there's a lot of different feelings. And sometimes you feel like you might be moving forward, but then it kind of gets a bit more messy. It's not linear. And then there is this arrow that continues with time, because grief is lifelong, that our life fills in around the grief, but it's always there in some capacity. That I mentioned before, there are no 5 stages. There are 5 stages, but not in the way that a lot of people think there are 5 stages. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, researcher, she came up with the 5 stages of grief. And she did her research for 5 stages of grief for people who were dying. That was their anticipatory grief, that people who were dying had these 5 stages. And society, because we want grief to be linear, we looked at these 5 stages and said, great, there's something that we can kind of hold on to, that we know what to expect. But it is not intended for grievers, that it is much more of this squiggly swirly line. That typical grief is messy. It eventually does get better, but it is messy. So it's not a disorder. Again, the goal of treatment is that symptom reduction, that we're not going to get over it, but we're going to learn to live with it. And everyone's grief is different. Like we want to be really curious about what people's grief feels like. That grief reactions can be normalized, because there's so many different grief reactions, to be normalized and validated, because everyone's grief is different and individual.
So we want to talk a little bit about kids' grief and how it's different from grown-up grief and even adolescent and teen grief. I think a lot of us think about grief as grown-ups, and sometimes if we haven't had a significant loss, we don't necessarily think about how kids are grieving. It's kind of how we forget sometimes what it's like to be a kid, right? So kids' grief is very much based upon the developmental age. around the age between 6 and 8 is when kids start to understand that grief is final. That meaning that no matter what religion or culture you believe in, no one ever comes back in the same body as the same person. So that grief, or that when a person dies, it is final for that person. So it's around age 6 to 8 that they start to kind of concretize that. They also grieve in kid-sized doses. A lot of the parents that we work with feel like their kids aren't grieving right because they're not having the same reactions that they are as parents or as grown-ups. And, you know, Erin was talking about the individualisticness of grief, and it sometimes works that way between parents and kids too. So they grieve in these kid-sized doses, meaning they grieve in the same way they do lots of other things. It is very normal for kids to go back to school. It is very normal for them to play at the playground, to do the things that they always did, and then have these short periods of more intense feelings, or a lot of times it comes out behaviorally. You might see more trips to the nurse at school. You might see trouble focusing at school, getting into more trouble. The opposite end, you might see incredible focus, very much focused on school, like not doing the fun stuff. Looks different for every kid. They also lots of questions, especially for the little kids. They're trying to figure it out, right? So it's usually at the most inopportune times, like when you're just trying to get out the door for the day and they want to know, you know, what it feels like to die, you know, or they have these kind of thoughts about the things that we already understand as grownups. They're trying to figure it out. And so they'll ask the same questions over and over, which can be hard for us as grownups to kind of consistently answer these questions, especially if we're also grieving, right? As they grow and age and develop and go through different milestones and developmental shifts, their understanding of loss and death changes, right? So I like to explain this as when I was a kid, I used to listen to the radio because I'm that old. And there would be songs on the radio and I would think I knew the words to the song and I would think I knew what it meant. And then as I got a little older, like teenager, I was like, those aren't the words to that song. And then as I got even older, maybe even an adult, and I like hear the song again, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not what that song even means. So that's not even what it meant. So same thing happens with grief and lots of other things in kids' life. As they get older, they start to understand it differently. And then sometimes those questions reappear as they're starting to understand. Also things like milestones, holidays, anniversaries, like anniversary of when the person died, birthday of other folks' birthdays, holidays, graduations, big events can kick up that grief, right? Because there's somebody missing. A lot of times, like I said before, grief comes out in kids behaviorally. They don't always have the language that we do as grownups to explain their feelings. A lot of the work that we do is kind of helping that support them in some of that language, getting them to maybe be able to identify some feelings where they show up in their bodies, what it feels like when you're mad, you know? So a lot of times we, as those of us who are parents of little kids and who have parented little kids, understand that it's a lot of behavior, right? Or if you work in a school, you understand that too. So it sometimes takes a while to get them to get to that language. Also, a lot of times it's hard to understand what they're asking, right? They will ask a question and I see this with my own kids. They will ask me a question. I'm like, where are we going with this? And it's really them trying to make kind of understanding of what is happening. A lot of times grief rituals and mourning rituals make sense to us as grownups, but don't make sense to kids. So they have a lot of questions around it. Sometimes if you're a parent, you're not the one that they're going to ask. A lot of kids talk about not wanting to upset their parents. And I think, you know, it's kind of mutual in that way. Parents don't want to upset their kids. Kids don't want to upset their parents. So sometimes they might go to someone at school, or they might go to a therapist, or they might go to, we had one family who the mom said that the daughter always spoke to her aunties about her grief. And so just having those resources and support systems can be really helpful. And just understanding that, kids are protective of their parents too. And if anybody wants to share in the chat, we did have this question, like, what have you noticed in your child and in yourself when it comes to grief? If you are a griever, or if your kids are grievers, feel free to put it in the chat. Sometimes that can be really helpful for normalizing for other folks that, like, I always say, as long as a kid isn't doing something that is dangerous to themselves or others, it is probably normal grief. So just if you feel comfortable to put things in the chat, that would be great. You can go ahead on to team, Erin.
All right, so we do want to acknowledge also the current experience of teenagers, of adolescents. And this is also like a slide that has been adapted throughout the past couple of years in terms of the current experience of teenagers. But a lot of it still is their reality. That teens do have similar reactions to adults, but they are still developing cognitively, emotionally. That teenagers and adolescents are still figuring out the world. So they are taking in all these different experiences and adding them to their person. So a lot of what they're experiencing now, just within their community, within their life, within society, is really shifting their worldviews. So we just want to give adolescents just a little bit of acknowledgement of really what they're going through, because they've been through a lot just within the last couple of years, and they are continuing to go through a lot. That teens often do conceal some of their like true feelings or some of those inside feelings. They might present a bit more as maybe withdrawn or losing interest in what they were previously interested in, or having trouble in school. But you also might see the opposite. Sometimes teens who are grieving, they are really interested in school. They try to kind of fill their time with a lot of different activities, or doing really well in school because that's what they think that their person would have wanted for them to succeed. So sometimes you see kind of both sides to that. But a lot of the social isolation, lots of grief triggers currently, those secondary losses, and we'll talk about those, I think, in the next slide. But secondary losses are all those losses that happen around that primary loss, that there's a person who has died, but that has affected so many other things within a person in a child's life. Their brain development, teens are still developing. Sometimes we forget that with teens, that we're like, they're small adults, they're fine, but they are still developing cognitively. Brain is not fully developed until early 20s. Again, shifts in worldview. There's so much happening in this world that they are reacting to and responding to within their own way. There's continued uncertainty. They've had a lot of missed milestones. And then what does that mean for the future? So we just want to really acknowledge also where teens are within their own grief journey.
Okay, I want to comment. There's a couple of things in the chat. There's one specifically, I was writing a thing to it, but I'll just say it out loud. Someone was talking about a 6-year-old. With the younger kids, we use a lot of books. There are a lot of really good grief books out there. And there's even ones that are pet focused, but it can be really helpful. Like, we usually in our groups do read a book and then do an activity around it. But that's the way kids are used to learning in school a lot of times, is through books. So books can be really, really helpful. I'm just thinking of one off the top of my head. There's a book called Ida Always, and it's about the two polar bears who lived in Central Park, and one dies. And it's beautifully written and it's beautifully illustrated. It is really hard to get through as a grown-up because it is a tearjerker, but something like that can be really helpful, especially, I think parents, a lot of times and I say this as a parent, right? Like, I did this work as a therapist and then became a parent, and then had to do it with my own family, my own kids, when someone died. And doing it as a parent is so hard. Answering all of the questions, knowing the right enough things to say. It's Erin, can you type it in? It's called Ida Always, and it's by Karen Levis, the book. Knowing the right things to say, and like, just know that you're gonna mess it up probably. And it's okay to mess it up as long as you're willing to like work through it. Right. So I think that's a real stress for parents too. So just acknowledging that like, understand that you might mess it up, that you might not get the answers right, that these are hard questions, especially with the little kids. It's not that it's easier with the teenagers, absolutely not, because they have really intense questions too, but just like, be willing not to be the perfect parent in this way. All right, so we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I do want to acknowledge this like time of collective loss that we're living in. Like, we talked about kids and teens, and I think about it. We live in New York City, and this September, there were kids who went back to school, and they hadn't been in school for possibly almost a year and a half. Right? Because some folks did remote schooling, there was hybrid, schools were opening and closing, especially here in New York. And so just thinking about losses like that, right? These like more ambiguous losses. There's a woman named Pauline Boss, love her. She talks a lot, she coined the term ambiguous loss. And those are the losses that aren't death, right? They're things like divorce, deportation, incarceration, COVID, right? Like this time of COVID and all of the losses that we had during that time that maybe weren't death, right? Doesn't mean they can't have grief attached to them. So I think we're all coming out of this time in which we're grievers, right? In some capacity. And, some people are moving forward faster. Some people are still like, they had a lot of different things. There's housing, when you're in transitional housing or you've lost your house, you've lost your job, identity, food insecurity, all of those things add to this time of collective loss that we're living in. So grief is something that we're all kind of coping with in some capacity. And I think sometimes giving it that name of grief can be helpful, right? Because sometimes it's like, why am I feeling like this? What is this feeling? Why are my kids feeling this way? Like this kind of like malaise, or, all the things that we've gone through. So just giving it a name can be helpful for some folks. So I just want to kind of honor and acknowledge this time that we are living in and hopefully moving through, right? I'm hoping that, this picture of all these folks with these masks maybe might not be our all the time reality at some point, right? So just thinking about that and giving yourself some grace, right? Giving yourself some grace. Okay, so talked about grief and how it's individualistic for each person, right? Grown up through kid. And so we want to talk a little bit about some factors that can influence a person's grief. So I'm going to go through these. So important relationship with the person who died, right? Whether it was a close relationship or not a close relationship. I think most of the time we think about when a person was close with the person who died, but sometimes grief can be really tricky when a person didn't have a close relationship with the person. So thinking about the relationship and how it can affect a kid or our own grief, right? A kid or teen's temperament. Those of us who either work or have children know that every kid has their own temperament, and some kids are, I don't want to use the word tougher because it just seems like a judgment word, but like some kids have a tougher temperament, some kids have a sadder temperament, some kids cope a little bit better with adversity. So some of this is based on a kid's temperament and what they're, someone in the chat talked about their teenager already struggling with depression and then going through grief. That's part of a temperament, right? Like they're already possibly struggling with some depression and sadness, and then they're adding another a factor onto that, right? Family and support network. Kids and teens have lots of different people that they interact with every day, whether it's the school, whether it's the bus driver, whether it is church, whether it is people in the community, like lots of different people. And so family members. So just thinking about in which ways that support network can be helpful, in which ways it can grow, or in which ways that it's not helpful, right? There are some times in which our family and our support network are not helpful. So just thinking about that and how the influence that it can have. History of trauma and loss, this can really be huge. If you have multiple losses, if you have a history of trauma, it can be harder to cope with another loss. Associated losses, so those secondary losses that Erin was talking about, whether, you know, a lot of times we have families where one of the caregivers has died, and so they have financial issues because that person was the breadwinner, right? And so maybe they have to change their housing, or maybe they have to, and with that they change schools or communities or neighborhoods. So just thinking about all of these additional losses that can happen after a person dies. I think a lot of times people just focus on the death of the person, which is huge and impactful, but they forget about all these little things that are secondary and associated losses to a person dying. The focus of support, making sure that maybe sometimes, you know, a lot of times support is given, but it's given for behavior, right? Like in school, it is the behavior is identified, but not necessarily that it's the grief that might be the trigger. Feelings and fantasies about the responsibility for death. This one is huge. And I don't know that I thought about it until I started working with families and kids who were grieving. With kids, I call it a little bit of magical thinking. And this is that a lot of kids think that they have some sort of culpability, that they have some blame in a person's death, even if it is a heart attack, right? Something that a kid had could not have done anything to cause. And we do it as grown-ups too, right? Like I've had people in my life die and I'm like, why didn't I make them go to the doctor, right? Like, or why didn't I do this? Why didn't I intervene in some way? Or why didn't I? So even that is this like feelings and fantasies about responsibility of death. Kids have it a lot, like a lot of the kids that we talk to, and it's a lot of times they aren't telling their primary caregiver about it because they're nervous, right? So just thinking about these ways in which they might be having these feelings or fantasies about their responsibility in the person's death, especially around COVID. We had a lot of kids who were worried that they gave their person COVID, you know, and so just acknowledging, listening, and also doing some reality testing. Like, you know, even myself as a grown-up, I can't make any other grown-up do what I want them to do, right? Even as much as I want that. Also, you know, another factor that influences is beliefs about death in your culture or your race or your religion, right? We all have different ways in which we view death, in which we view the person who died, in which we view the way that they died possibly, and in the ways in which we're supposed to mourn and ritualize and talk or not talk about the person who died. So thinking about how that might influence, and also if there's some dissonance. We're going to talk about culture in like a slide or two. And then the nature and circumstances of the death. We're going to talk a little bit more about suicide later, but just thinking about how a person dies and how it might affect a kid's or teen's ability to mourn. And I think, you know, normally we're like suicide, homicide, overdose, like the more stigmatized stuff, but even things like hospice, right? Like a kid or teen or a grown-up having to watch a person die, right? Slowly. So just thinking about these ways in which a person died. Some of this also relates to getting to say goodbye or not getting to say goodbye. So all of these different things can factor and influence a way a kid, a teen, or a grown-up grieves and mourns. All right, so there's lots of different kind of theories on grief. Not lots, there's some. All right, so there's some theories on grief. We talked about how the 5 stages was for anticipatory grief for people who were dying and not for us grievers. So this is one that I really love. It's called the dual process model by Strobe and Shute. And the thing I love about it is this middle part, this like oscillation part, because I think for grievers, and for those who are our support system, they either want us in one camp or the other, right? They either want us in this loss oriented or this restoration oriented. But really, if you stick in one, you're going to get stuck, right? Like if you only focus on restoring and future, you're going to get stuck because you haven't dealt with the lost stuff. And if you only get stuck in the focus on the lost stuff, you're not going to move forward, not moving on, but moving forward, right? Because life is continuing to happen. So this dual process model talks about how it kind of pings back and forth. Like you don't stay in one place for the whole time. And I think for grievers, this is important to remember. And, you know, some of this is based on your culture and your religion, because there are some times in which you have to stay more loss oriented due to that. But this like pinging back and forth can be really helpful so that you aren't getting stuck, right? You're moving forward, you're continuing to live, and you're dealing with the lost stuff because it's happening. But then you're also having this like restoration stuff and like having some distraction and some distance from it and focusing on your new roles, your identities, your adaptations, right? So this is one that we really like in our program because I feel like it's realistic and it's actually helpful as a way to look at grief. All right, so we're going to talk about culture, race, and religion because it is a huge part of grief, right? Like intertwined. Culture, race, and religion, in most cases, tells us how we grieve and mourn. It tells us how we ritualize, it tells us how we memorialize. It gives us the steps a lot of times. And that can be really helpful for folks, especially at the beginning when a loss has just happened and you're trying to figure out how to ritualize and memorialize. There are steps, right? It's concrete most of the time. There also can be some times when it doesn't line up, like it can be, there can be some dissonance, right? So thinking about how this all intertwines, thinking about how we can use this to support ourselves, like maybe our spirituality is something that is supportive during grief, maybe it is something that helps us explain to kids what's happening. Lots of different ways that our culture, race, and religion can be really helpful, but it also defines a lot. So just thinking about the ways in which it informs us. So thinking about the spoken and unspoken messages, especially around when a person dies. And if they die in a way that is more stigmatized, like the messages that are talked about that person or about the grievers, right? If there is a right or permission to grieve, things that sometimes death makes us question our higher power, right? How do I believe in God or my higher power when my child was murdered? And that's like an extreme example, but it can be as simple as like, how can I believe in my higher power when my husband died? You know? So just thinking about these different ways in which it makes us question our spirituality sometimes, which can be troublesome to some folks, right? What's taboo culturally, religiously, what's acceptable? Is there dissonance there? When is there flexibility, right? When is there, you have to do it a certain way, and when is there flexibility? And if maybe, a lot of us as Americans have blended families, right? Like we have families from different races, religions, cultures. And so sometimes whose rituals happen? Are they prescribed? Do you choose them? There's this really great book called Black Widow. It's a grown-up book. It's not a kid's book. And she talks about, she's a Black woman from the South, and her husband, who dies suddenly, is a Jewish man, and how their culture and religion differed so much in the rituals around how they were going to honor him when he died. And she talks about kind of that, like the differences in it. It's a really funny book about grief if you're looking for something like that. I'll put the name in the chat after I stop talking. And then the role of forgiveness, like, depending on how the person dies, is there forgiveness about certain things? Is there anger? Is there sadness? Thanks, Erin. So just thinking about all of these different ways in which culture intertwines with not only how we ritualize and memorialize, but also how our grief takes shape. All right, so we're gonna shift a little bit to suicide, because I know that when we spoke to Lisa, I knew that was a topic that was important to some of you all. So we want to talk a little bit about suicide bereavement. So those folks who have had someone who has died by suicide. I want to give the caveat that the phrase committing suicide is no longer used. It comes from when suicide was illegal. So now folks talk, the term is either died by suicide or suicided, like using it as a verb. So I just want to give that caveat because it can add some stigma when we're talking about committing, right? So what makes suicide bereavement different? Is it different? Can be, right? So grievers tend to struggle with making meaning of the death. There are a lot of questions sometimes: why the person did it, why they didn't reach out for help, how they did it, when they did it. There's a TED talk that we use sometime about that a therapist talks about her client dying by suicide, and it was 12 hours before their session. And she was like, he couldn't just hold on for 12 hours, like, so just having this, making meaning out of the person's death can be really difficult sometimes around suicide. There's a higher level of guilt, blame, responsibility, and anger. We see that a lot with our families who have someone who has died by suicide. And it's just really hard and something that needs to get worked through, right? Heightened feelings of rejection and abandonment. And this can be for, if say it's a partner who dies, it can be the other partner, or it can be from the kids, right? Or the fears that they will feel that way. We have a mom who her husband died by suicide, and she's worried about how to tell them when they're a little older that their dad didn't choose to live, and so we will do some coaching around that, and some help with that. But it's hard, that those feelings of rejection and abandonment. Sometimes there is confusion whether it was an accident or whether the person meant to do it on purpose. I think this happens a lot with especially the opioid crisis, when folks possibly are doing something. Also a lot of with drug overdoses, other ways of folks dying by suicide as well. But I think those are one of the big ones. The motives and the frame of mind of the person who died, especially if you hadn't seen the person in a while. The traumatic aspects. I think this is something that I didn't always think about until I worked with families who had someone who died by suicide, and it's how the person is found, right? Who finds them and what that's like for folks. And there can be some trauma in that. How the person chooses to end their life. There are ways, this might sound crass, but there are ways that are less, there are some ways in which the person looks like they're asleep, right? And then there are other ways which are more graphic, right? Whether the person had previous threats, previous attempts, and also family secrets. I think this is a huge one. We'll probably talk about it a little later too. And there's tends to be more secrets around suicide because there is stigma around it. It's also trying to explain it to folks. It's a difficult one, and we encourage folks to kind of be as honest as possible. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to talk to kids about suicide next.
All right, so this is a tip sheet from Common Ground Grief Center. They produce this tip sheet that goes through just how to talk to kids about both suicide and violent deaths. So it has it broken down into like 3 to 6-year-olds, 7 to 11, and 12 to 17. And just going through some of their reactions, how to help, what that age group, what their normal grief responses might be. And then just how to talk to kids about it. In general, in talking to kids about grief, loss, suicide, homicide, being able to ask them open-ended questions that we don't want to assume anything. And that goes, we want to be culturally curious as well, but we want to be able to provide a neutral, safe setting for kids to be able to express what it is that they want to express. That sometimes when we are talking to kids about grief, we as adults, we don't always know what to say. And a lot of things are said with fantastic intention, great intention, but there are no magic words for grief. And I think that's where sometimes we get tripped up in talking to kids, is that we don't want kids to be in pain. We don't know what to say. So that question of what do I say is a really big question that we get. And often we don't always know what to say. We don't have those magic words, and it's okay to say that, especially when kids are asking these really big questions. It's okay to say, I don't know. And maybe asking them, like, what do you think? Just trying to ask just some of these open questions that they can start to fill in what they are thinking, what they're feeling. So on the tip sheet, they have just some things on the side here, just being in a neutral, safe setting, having some of their favorite adults present, using age appropriate language is really important as well. You're not going to talk to a 5-year-old the same way you would talk to a 15-year-old, and just knowing where they are cognitively. Kids around 8 or 9 are still figuring out that death itself is final. So kids younger than that are still figuring that out about death itself. So at that age, just taking that into consideration, that you want to be able to use that age appropriate language and those concepts. Delivering information in bite-sized pieces, that we talked about how kids grieve in kid-sized doses. And that's the same with processing information as well, that we want to give them enough information without too many details if it's not necessary, but giving what is needed and giving those bite-sized pieces of information. When they ask a question, answer what you can, and being prepared for mixed emotions. That, like Crystal was saying, sometimes when we hear from our caregivers that their kids aren't grieving the right way, a lot of times when they say that, they mean it in a way of, my kid isn't crying a lot, or they seem totally fine, or just that they aren't grieving in a way that the adults would perceive as their own grief. And that's where we talk about the individualistic grief, that kids do grieve differently just because they're kids, but they grieve differently because they're their own person. So being prepared for mixed emotions, that kids might not burst out into tears. It might take them a while, or it might take them those developmental stages to be able to go through and really figure out grief for themselves. Giving creative and physical outlets is really important for kids. Kids express themselves a lot of times through their body in these physical outlets. And they don't always have the language. That kids are figuring out the language of these feelings, of what's going on in their body. So being able to give these physical outlets, and also the creative outlets to express what it is that they're feeling. And that it's okay to talk about the person who died. A lot of kids in our group express that they feel that they cannot talk about the person who died within their family or within their friends, within the group of people who have been affected by the loss, because they feel it, they don't want to upset their family or their caregivers, that they don't want to make anyone else more sad than they already are. So giving kids permission to grieve, and giving kids permission to express and to talk about the person and to ask questions is really important. And being able to tell them when you don't know the answer, or we don't have those magic words, because I know we wish we had them, but just being able to ask those questions together is really helpful.
Okay, we really want to talk a little bit about family considerations as well. So a lot of times we want to think about the obstacles to parent and caregivers' ability to be responsive. A lot of parents and caregivers are struggling with their own grief. A lot of the families that we work with talk about, struggling to get out of bed every day, and still having to care for their kids and do all of the things and go to work. So a lot of times it is not because a person or a parent or a caregiver doesn't want to be responsive. It is because they are struggling with their own grief, right? A lot of times also parents, I say this as a parent and a caregiver, we are very protective of our kids. I don't want to see my kids crying. I don't want to see them upset. So sometimes I have an urge to protect them from painful feelings, and I might not want to be talking about some of this stuff. And then the thing that happens though is that then kids feel like they can't talk about it, and so it creates this kind of like isolation chamber in some ways, where, the kids aren't talking to the parents because they are being protective of their parents, and the parents aren't talking to the kids because they're being protective of the kids, so nobody's talking about it. We really encourage folks to talk about it. When we do groups, we meet with the family. We also try to do some sessions where the family is involved as well, and things like bringing in mementos and that kind of stuff, and encouraging conversations. If our caregiver and parent groups are separate, where they are separate from the kids group, we try to tell them what's going on in the kids group so they have an understanding of what questions their kid might bring up, or like even talking about some of those questions in group and normalizing the experience. Family traditions. There are certain ways in which we ritualize and memorialize. There's also certain ways which we have to adapt traditions. So just thinking about the ways in which something this makes me think of is like my stepdad died a few years ago, and every year on his birthday, my kids and I still make him a cake, and we blow out candles, and it's been a tradition. It was a tradition before when he was alive, and then we continue that tradition on his birthday. So just thinking about, that's a family tradition. It's something we do. My kids expect it. But they can be something that is like related around the holiday. I also think about how he used to be the person who carved the turkey at Thanksgiving. And then the first Thanksgiving without him, my husband was like YouTubing how to carve a turkey because that role became his, So just thinking about how family traditions shift. We had a family who the matriarch died, and she was always the one who had all the festivities at her apartment. And so it was like, where are we going to do it this year? And how are we going to honor her? This is our first one without her. So just thinking about the traditions that either you already have or that you will then adapt. Community expectations. Whew, people have lots of opinions. People also say things that are well-intentioned, absolutely well-intentioned, that are awful, right? So there are always going to be folks, it's like when I was talking about the dual process, who are really there for your moving on and moving forward. And then there's some people who really want you to be sad all the time. So just thinking about those expectations as a griever and how they can affect your ability to respond. Culture and religious factors. The type of death, how a person died, can be important in that. Maybe the person died in the home. Maybe the person died of something that is more stigmatized. So thinking about how that can affect a family's ability to grieve and mourn. And then increased responsibilities and role changes for kids and teens. So a lot of times we think about this in the way of like possibly teens having more responsibilities. And then I think about the role changes of kids, younger kids, like especially if a sibling dies, when maybe there were 3 kids and the oldest sibling dies and now the middle kid is the oldest. And so just thinking about the ways in which roles in the family changed and the ways in which responsibilities can change after a person dies. So just some things to think about when you're thinking about families and how you grieve and these factors that can influence the mourning. All right, so we're just going to talk a little bit about making meaning because we have about 2 minutes left. So thinking about, we've talked a lot about some of this before earlier today, adapting rituals and family traditions. A lot about making meaning is having a sense of control, right? Feeling like there is some control, because grief can feel like that squiggle, right? And thinking about small ways of making meaning. I think when we think about making meaning, we think about things like starting a foundation, having a scholarship fund, these like bigger things. There are really like small ways in which you can do it. I like to think about, the ways in which I honor people who have died in my life, but maybe it's eating their favorite meal, right? And maybe it is small things that I do. I hear a song, so just different ways, or maybe I write something about them, or maybe they inspire me to do something, so there's smaller ways of making meaning. One time we were at a program and a coworker had died, and the other coworkers had been they'd all been going to the gym together, and they talked about how they were going to continue to go to the gym, even though the main person who was like doing it all was is the one who died. So that was a way of them making meaning of his death, to keep that going, to keep themselves healthy. And then resiliency and hope for the future, not to be confused with toxic positivity. We are not here for toxic positivity, but having a little bit of hope for the future. And that can be small little things like looking forward to a vacation, looking forward to like something that's coming up. You know, it can be these small things. It doesn't have to be the like the big future, right? It can be little things, and thinking about your own resiliency and building up that muscle. It's a muscle that we all have that we have to keep building. It's like going to the gym. We got to keep it going, right? So, but not confusing that with toxic positivity. Like everything is great, everybody has to be happy. No, we're not talking about that. So just thinking about these like hopefulness, small ways of having hope for the future and building your resiliency muscle.
Right. As we just come to a close, we just want to start wrapping up and just start by reflecting back on that intention that you set about an hour ago. What were you here to do? Were you here for someone? Did you fulfill some of the reasons for being here? Is there something that you're walking away with? Just take a moment, just again, taking in those deep breaths and just thanking yourself for being here. That sometimes logging on to a training or webinar about heavy things can sit heavy in our body. So just thank yourself for being here, for taking the time for yourself and to be with others. And I do see that there are some questions in the chat.
All right, Crystal and Erin, if you have a couple minutes, I was trying to start my video, but wasn't able to answer, that would be great. But if not, I see your contact details. Are you able to have people send you their questions via your contact?
Yeah, that's fine. I can also, I'm just having trouble scrolling through the chat. Erin, do you see some of the questions?
Yes. So they're coming in. Just kind of throughout the slides.
I think you did cover a lot of the questions.
Yeah, I tried to do it as they were coming in.
Yeah, a lot of them were some really good comments, but
yeah.
One of the resources, I tried to put in some of the books that we had been talking about.
Yeah.
There are a lot of great children's books about grief. Imaginary, My Big Dumb Invisible Dragon is a great one.
I'm going to type some of them in.
Okay. So while you're doing that, I just want to let everyone know, if you would like a certificate of attendance, you can email me. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and I will send you a certificate of attendance at lisaunger@youthmentalhealthproject.org. And I just want to thank Crystal and Erin. Thank you so much for being with us today. This was so informative, so helpful for so many of us. Thank you for putting yourself out here and doing all the work that you do. We really can't thank you enough.
Thanks for inviting us.